Cool. So let's hear from some rooms. Let me go back to the breakout rooms. Got my nerd dice going on. Let's start with room number 3. Room number 3, Catherine, Sydney, and Joe. What kinds of ideas did you come up with for your user table? Like, how are you going to manage your followers? What sort of structure do you think you're going to follow there?
I guess I'll jump in. We're gonna go with the Twitter method, I guess, the followed and followers.
Okay.
Seems easier to implement at this point. Well, I did take a look at the friendship one. I think it's just missing the inverse relationship that I mentioned. But yeah, we want to kind of jump in on see how it works with the.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just a few clarifying questions then. So I register on your website and I add Joe and Sydney as friends. Now I can invite them, but they don't necessarily have to have me as a friend, and they won't necessarily be able to invite me to anything because they don't explicitly put my email in as a friend. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and that's an okay way of doing it. Like, we want to give you all the flexibility to kind of build this out however you like. And so it's okay if you want to take that route. It's totally okay. Yep. Cool. All right. Let's go to room number 4. Room number 4 was Adam, Phil, and Ryan. What did you all come up with?
This, I can jump in. Maybe Adam, I know you have our diagram that you could share real quick. Yeah, so I'm not super up on this, so I might need some help from Adam, but taking a stab at trying to explain this is helpful. So essentially we're, I think, going down the friendships path, where I think we still have a question on like how to connect these with the IDs, but so we have the user ID and the friend ID connecting to the singular key in the users table.
Okay.
Yeah, it was tricky. The whole self-referential thing with friendships. Adam had to explain that to me, and it's still kind of fuzzy. But
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, we did have a question. So we did do some research. We found this. You can have a friend on a friendship side on a friendships table, and just put in a class name as user, so it's referring to itself. We didn't do that. Like we saw examples of you could just do class user has many friends, class user, but we did it at the friendship level. We're wondering if there's any downside to that, or if that's totally okay.
Yeah,
you have to specify this here.
Yeah, so there, like I kind of mentioned before, I sent you into your breakout rooms. There are going to be a lot of different ways that you can process this. Even once you decide on a path, there's going to be many ways of doing this. And so yeah, that sort of structure would be fine. From there, it looked like you had a user ID, a viewing party ID, and whether they were a host or a guest at a viewing party in that table. Okay, cool. And then let's go with room number 7. Room number 7, go back to my breakout rooms. Room 7, Alex, James, and Max. Did you have anything different for how you're going to do your users and friends?
I think we had one just additional change, which was on the friends, as well as having a user ID and a friend ID. We would also have a status to check for approvals. So when a user requests a friend, the friend gets notified somehow, and they're the one that can change the status column.
Okay. All right, good. And then the previous group was it Adam, Phil, and Ryan. I noticed you had both an email and a username. Probably don't need both unless you really want it. I don't know that we're going to need both on there. I guess if you want like a real name associated with the email, then that would be fine. So you just got like a name of somebody. But if I've got 2 friends named John Smith, I'm not necessarily going to know like which one of those I intend to invite to my party unless you also show me the email address or something like that. So there might still be some stuff there to consider. But Cool. All right. So from there, let's talk a little bit about like the viewing party and how you're going to build out the viewing party. So let's go with room number 1, and that's Eli, Mike, and Robert. What did you all come up with for how you're going to build out your viewing party?
Eli, do you mind sharing since you've got the?
Yeah, I guess we're still a little mixed up.
Yeah.
I don't know if we've quite gotten to that point where
We've got the same, a very similar table layout to Phil, Ryan, and Adam. I actually wanted to ask the three of you, because this is the part we're kind of stuck on with our viewing party. I'm like kind of confused of how we're going to represent many friends in our viewing party. We've got one column here with the user ID /friend represents, which friend, but that's only one many-to-many relationship. And I was wondering, I couldn't really, I'm really stuck on this part of how are we going to represent in our DB, how we can have a viewing party with multiple friends from the host.
So you have a viewing party guest table. It could be something like that. We could have a viewing party. So one way that I've seen this modeled out is the viewing party table itself has like a host ID, and that points back to the user table of who the host is. And then you have like an actual like viewing party table, which is like everybody else that's been invited besides the host, where it's just the viewing party ID and the user ID of all of the other friends that I invited. Because I don't necessarily want to invite every friend every time I make a viewing party. And so you will need that distinction as you're planning that out. So just because you have a friend doesn't mean they're all coming to the party. We want to be able to specify this viewing party has only these friends. The other thing that you're going to run into is you will not be able to call the table viewing party because your application is called viewing party. You can't have a model match the same name as the application itself. So you will need to figure out what else you're going to call it besides a viewing party. And there are lots of other adjectives you can use and lots of other terms that you can use, but you will not be able to call it viewing party. You will run into a problem in Rails if you try to make a model called viewing party. So keep that in mind.
So to
viewing
kind
get
of like,
together, sure. Yeah. Shenanigans, I like that one. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
just to like rebound that back to you, we'll have a viewing party here, and then we have a host, and then we'll have another table that will represent all through the host, which of those friends are invited to that viewing party.
Right.
But how will that actually show up on the table, like in a literal sense? Because if we're referencing which relationships or which friends are coming, wouldn't that be like a user ID or a friend ID, but we couldn't have many IDs in that one record relative to the host as well?
Yeah, so that table will be a one-to-many, where you've got one viewing party ID with many user IDs attending. And those are just going to be the friends that you've invited. So again, this is just one way of doing it. You're actually going to have to figure out as a team like how you want to model this out. The last thing I want to spend the last couple of minutes talking about is what data from the movie database or the movie API are you going to have to store within your own database? So I'm curious if there are any groups that want to volunteer for what you've talked about there and what information you want to store about the viewing party, about like what the movie is that you want to watch. Let's go to Gus. What do you got?
Yeah, we talked about the idea of kind of storing like as little as possible, and just kind of recognizing that like the movie database it's a database, like it has a table of movies, and so there's no reason for us to like also create a table of movies. And if the only thing that we're storing is like whatever like ID that movie has like in their database, and we need that ID in order to do like an API call to get additional details about that movie. Like if that's the only piece of data that we need to store, then there's no reason to have a table for that. We would just store that information like on the party table. would have
Okay.
like a movie ID, and then you could use that to like make an API call to get additional information as needed, which, I mean, I assume that at some point you would be caching that information so that it's not like, you know, if I have a party where I'm going to watch Dark Phoenix, then I'm making an API call like every single time I like visit any page like in my session. But I think that like all you really need is that ID like for that database record in the movie database. And
Okay.
you know, maybe we'll find that we need more information to be stored locally in the long run, but I think like on the surface, like that's kind of what we talked about, is like that's really the only data point that we need, is that movie ID within their database.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Gus. Let's go to Sam.
I guess from a design perspective, like why can't I understand that we have a non-spoken agreement to not just save everything from the API. I understand that. But in terms of the requirements of the project, why can't we just save the runtime, the title, the genre into the database? It seems like it's a lot in terms of minimizing what to save in the database. But at the same time, I would say from a design perspective, adding additional hits in terms of API calls to get more if you need it seems like it'll slow down performance, and it'll affect the server of the API also. So from their side, I see why they wouldn't want us to save too much also, but at the same time, I don't think they want us to hit their API any more than we need to, as users of it. So I was thinking just the very basics that the project is requiring: the runtime of the movie, the title of the movie, the genre. Is that too much already?
I mean, how do you define too much? And to clarify, it's not that this is an unspoken agreement with the API. Most APIs will actually, like when you sign up for an API key, you are agreeing that you will not store like their information in any other retrievable format, including a database. But it's not like they know that you're building an application and they're not ever going to come knocking on your door. Now, if they find out that your API is literally scraping every little scrap of data out of their database, then they might get a little curious, you know, what you're doing with all that data. But if it only looks like, you know, we're hitting the top 40 movies every now and then, or top 20 movies every now and then, they're not going to care. They're only going to care if they literally see you scraping every little bit of data out of their database. Then they'll be like, are you trying to like build something to compete with us? And so it's not that it's unspoken. There is an actual agreement that you will not store the stuff in a database, but it does make sense to store some amount of data. So like Gus was saying, we want it to be minimal, but we also don't want to store everything, because some of that data will get stale over time. Like if you store the average rating of a movie, that's going to get stale as soon as somebody else adds a review on their website. That then goes into their database that your API is retrieving. And so that score is now stale. Any reviews that you store are now potentially stale, because that user could go back and change the review. They could delete the review. They could change the score of the review. And now that data is no longer valid. At the same time, Sam brings up a good point of, you know, maybe we could store the title, maybe the duration, maybe the genre. How much of that is actually important? It depends what all you want to show on that sort of welcome page. Like after they log in, when they look at their dashboard and they see the list of the movies there, if all you have is the movie ID, like if you're Gus and all you're storing is a movie ID, then to even draw that dashboard page, I've got to go out to the API just to fetch the movie title, just so I can say there's a viewing party about, you know, an X-Men movie next Thursday at such and such a time, and here's who's coming to the party. I've got to go hit the API just to get the title. So maybe it makes sense to store the title. The title's probably not going to change. The genre of the movie is probably not going to change. The duration of the movie is probably not going to change. If they come out with like a director's cut, that's going to be a whole other, you know, addition to their database, and it'll have a whole different ID, you know, with a different title and everything as well. So I think at a minimum, storing the ID and the title is like an absolute bare minimum that you should store. Whether you store the duration, I don't know. The duration is really only needed for when do you make the party and when is it going to start and stop. Other than that, like, I mean, you could, like, once you use that duration to figure out the start and stop time of your viewing party, you could just say, hey, we're going to watch this movie from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. next Saturday night. now you don't even have to really tell me the duration of the party. But one thing to keep in mind there is if the movie is 120 minutes long, you probably don't want to make a viewing party less than 120 minutes. Now, you could maybe go 5 minutes less if you're not going to sit and watch all the trailers or whatever. But if it's a Marvel movie, I'm sure as heck going to like sit and watch all the trailers at the end, or all the credits at the end, just to see any other trailers. So at a minimum, I would store the ID and the title. If you want to store some of the other information, I think that would be okay. But things like the description, the average rating, like some of that stuff, probably not worth storing because you're only going to show that on the show page. And if the show page, you're going to go hit the database to go get the reviews and all that other stuff anyway, you might as well go grab all of that stuff. Now, you could store a copy of that in the database, and then whenever you view the show page, go hit the API, go get a fresh copy of that data and repopulate your database at the same time. But that could mean that if I never go to the show page, I'm still tracking like stale data. So it's really up to you what you want to store. But I would try to keep it to a minimum if possible, because there is that agreement that you're not going to store all of that data. Plus, it doesn't make sense to store data that is going to change. So things like reviews and ratings and things like that, you don't want to store that. The title's probably not going to change. The duration's probably not going to change. The genres are not going to change. The cast isn't going to change. If the movie's already done, the cast isn't going to change. Now, I take that back. The cast could change. And who comes to mind there is, just think about X-Men movies, is Elliot Page. Elliot Page recently came out as transgender. It used to be Ellen Page, who was a member of an X-Men movie. And so that actor's name will now be updated. So if you store the old actors' names, that actor's name is now stale and no longer valid. So things like that, we got to try to keep in mind. So some of that data, I think if you can fetch it from the API, just get it from the API. But like Gus was saying, if all you store is the ID, is that enough? Technically, yeah. But then even to draw that dashboard, I've got to go hit the API for every viewing party in order to collect all those titles. And that's making a whole bunch of calls. Like if I'm invited or hosting, let's say I've got 100 movies on that dashboard page for all the different viewing parties that I'm hosting and invited to, that's 100 API calls. Where if we store the ID and the title, I can click on that and go to a show page. And now I'm making like maybe 2 or 3 API calls to go collect everything I need to draw the show page. And that's less lift on the API. So just kind of seeing stuff going by in the chat as well about like performance and API hits and stuff like that. I know we're eating into our lunch break here, so I'll wrap up here, but hopefully that'll give you some ideas. From a user perspective, storing an email and a password at a minimum, absolutely. If you want to do a username, you can. I think for the invitation purpose, you may need to show both if there are friends that have similar names, or if you're going to do like just a first name kind of thing. Then you may want to show more data so that they have a better idea who they're inviting. For a viewing party, you cannot call the table viewing party. So don't call your model viewing party. You'll end up with conflicts there. But you'll need to figure out how do we track who's hosting it and then who the guests are going to be. The guests will need to be a different table, but you could put the host in the viewing party table, like whatever you call it. You could put it in there. I would make a movie table with the API's ID and the title, and put that movie ID in whatever your viewing party table is going to be, make a reference that way. So how you make these will have a big implication on how you develop your software. And this is why we wanted to spend a little bit of time just kind of noodling about some of these ideas, so that now when you work on your project this afternoon, you've got a little bit of groundwork going as far as how you want to plan this stuff out. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have other questions about database modeling, if you want to get in on some of that, feel free to drop those into the Code Help channel, and I'll address those. I'll be around for the afternoon too if you've got questions. I've got like a phone call at 2 o'clock for a reference for somebody, but aside from that, I'll be around for talk. If you want me to do like an office hours or something like that, I'm happy to do that too. All right. Otherwise, I'll let you go. And I will have an attendance thread at right before 1 o'clock. So pay attention for that. Make sure you answer that in Slack. All right. See you, everyone.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Ian.
Cheers.